Hey everyone, I think we're going to get started in just a moment.
Thanks, Rebecca. I was on mute. Yep, we're gonna wait just a couple minutes for folks to filter on, and then we'll get started. But I hope everyone is having a good start to your evening. All right, so before we get started here, I just want to remind folks about a couple housekeeping items. Again, welcome everyone to the Factory Farm Biogas webinar. Oregon needs real climate solutions. We're really excited to have you all here tonight as we talk about factory farm gas here in Oregon. So I just want to remind folks, this is a Zoom webinar, which means that everyone in attendance will be able to see and hear our speakers, but they won't be able to see or hear you, and you won't be able to see other participants as well. So that means if you're, working out while watching, we are none the wiser. However, we do have a Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. You should see a little bubble that says Q&A. You can click on that to submit your questions at any time during the webinar. After our presentations, we'll have some time for questions. Christina Began, who is the Stand Up to Factory Farms organizer and is here with us tonight, is monitoring the Q&A, and will answer questions as she can, and we'll save some other questions for the Q&A portion of the evening. So again, please feel free to add those as we go along. Additionally, closed captioning is available and should be generated automatically at the bottom of your screen. But if you don't see that for some reason, find the button with the 2 C's on it and click that in order to access closed captioning. Thanks again to everyone for joining, and we'll go ahead and get started here. Next slide, John. Perfect. In case this is your first event with us, Food and Water Watch and our sister organization, Food and Water Action, fight for a healthy and livable planet, economic fairness, justice for all, and real democracy. And we do that by focusing on 3 main campaigns or 3 main problems. So the first of that is stopping climate change by halting the production and use of fossil fuels, which we'll be talking about today. Our second kind of main issue that we focus on is saving our drinking water. And our last, but definitely not least, is banning factory farms to create a just food system that protects our air, water, climate, communities, and family farms. This is the main issue that we work on here in Oregon by stopping the expansion of mega dairies in coordination with the Stand Up to Factory Farms Coalition, which includes a host of other local, state, and national groups. We know that stopping mega dairies here in Oregon is essential to achieving our climate goals. So we've teamed up with a ton of other great organizations to make that happen. And in order to achieve these goals, we believe in mobilizing regular people like you and me to build political power to move bold and uncompromising solutions to our most pressing problems of today. And now that you know a bit more about us, we'd like to take a moment today to acknowledge the land that we're speaking to you all from is stolen land from Indigenous people. Personally, I'm calling in from what is often referred to as Eugene, Oregon, but has been and continues to be the home of Kalapuya people, including the tribes of the Chalamuya and the Winnefeli. After the Willamette Valley Treaty of 1855, the Kalapuya people, along with several other Indigenous groups, were forcibly removed from the Willamette Valley. Today, the descendants of these people are part of both the Confederated Tribes of the Grand Ronde community of Oregon and the Confederate Tribes of the Siletz Indians. Christina will be posting resources in the chat to look up the native land you occupy and learn more from Native people in Oregon themselves by visiting the websites of the Confederated Tribes of the Grand Ronde and the Siletz. Thank you so much. And with that, let's get into the topics that we'll be covering tonight related to factory farm gas. So just a quick note, our speakers will likely switch between factory farm gas and biogas. Both of those names mean the same thing, and we can get into the differences there, but just wanted to make that a quick note. So we'll talk about what factory farm gas is and dive into that, why it's a false solution to our climate crisis, and how factory farm gas is operating in Oregon currently. Then we'll take a moment to dive into some Q&A. So be sure again to submit your questions. And then last, we'll wrap up with some action items for you to help stop the continued build out of factory farm gas here in Oregon. And instead of hearing from me all night long, we have some really amazing expert guests that are going to share their wealth of knowledge on this issue. First up, we have Tara Heinzen, who is our Food and Water Watch's legal director and also lives and works here in Oregon and has a ton of knowledge about the state of biogas here. I'll let her introduce herself a bit more, but that's who we'll have first. And then Rebecca Wolf will follow. She is our policy analyst and based in DC and has done a lot of work on factory farm biogas, factory farm gas in the past. They'll have, again, a chance to introduce themselves a little bit more, but I'll go ahead and hand it over to Tara.
Great, thanks, Mackenzie. Like Mackenzie said, I am Food and Water Watch's legal director. I'm based in Portland, and I've been doing factory farm work for almost 20 years in both the legal and organizing and consulting capacities. And it's become increasingly clear in recent years that biogas is a huge threat to all of our work to reform our food system and make it more just and sustainable. And so I'm really excited to be able to share some of the work that we're doing tonight. I'm just going to kick us off with a little bit of an overview before handing it over to Rebecca to kind of get into the nitty-gritty a bit more. So just to start, it's critical to address greenhouse gas emissions from factory farms. Agriculture is a significant contributor to climate emissions overall, and that share is likely to grow, particularly as other sectors reduce their emissions. In particular, agriculture is, previous slide. In particular, agriculture is the largest sector for methane emissions, with enteric emissions as the main source, followed by manure management emissions as a smaller sector. Methane is an incredibly powerful, short-lived climate pollutant, meaning that steep cuts in methane emissions in the short term is one of the most important ways that we can cut emissions. The fraction of methane from manure management at factory farms is growing very quickly because we're losing family farms and because livestock production is increasingly dominated by factory farms. And factory farms use manure management practices that lead to increased methane creation in the first place. So we absolutely need to reduce emissions from factory farms if we're going to address climate change. But tonight we're going to focus on why digesters are not the way to do it. Next slide, please. So just to get us on the same page, like Mackenzie said, when I refer to biogas, I'm specifically talking about the gas produced at factory farms from anaerobic waste management systems at these facilities. Manure is put into an anaerobic digester, and in the digester, microbes break down constituents of the livestock waste, creating biogas as a byproduct and capturing it. This biogas is comprised mostly of methane, along with CO2, hydrogen sulfide, ammonia, and other gases. And so far, most factory farm anaerobic digesters have been built for what they called on-farm use to generate heat and electricity for the farm itself. But due to new trading schemes and incentives that we'll discuss a bit later, we're increasingly seeing large projects that are built to collect biogas on a regional scale, treat it to make so-called pipeline quality gas, which is chemically identical to fossil natural gas, and then inject it into natural gas pipelines, where it's referred to as renewable natural gas, or RNG. This photo you're seeing here is of a series of Smithfield hog factory farms and digesters recently built in Utah, where Smithfield actually never had any business previously. And it was built, we think, specifically as part of a Smithfield initiative to capitalize on RNG and the incentives associated with it. Next slide. So there are a few reasons that digester technology has been slow to catch on at factory farms. One is that there are a lot of technical barriers to entry. Digesters cost millions of dollars. And as this EPA chart shows, they're only technologically workable for the largest factory farms, those with at least 500 dairy cows or 2,000 pigs. Even then, they're difficult to operate effectively. Several have had manure spills and even explosions, even facilities that have full-time engineers operating the digesters. They're also really difficult to operate efficiently. And even at perfect efficiency, they can only capture methane from manure management. But if you recall from the first slide, enteric emissions are an even bigger problem, and digesters do nothing to address those emissions. Next slide. So in part due to all of these challenges, RNG is very expensive. RNG costs several times what frac gas costs, and building RNG infrastructure at remote factory farms requires new treatment facilities and pipelines. As gas utilities are required to reduce emissions to meet state greenhouse gas targets, moving to RNG will also raise rates for citizens. While this will spur some customers to electrify, which is a good thing, it'll also disproportionately impact lower income consumers who can't afford to electrify. The burdens of maintaining gas infrastructure will then also fall on this shrinking base of gas customers, raising further costs for those who can least afford it. Next slide. Excuse me. So even if these costs can be overcome with subsidies and trading programs, RNG is severely limited in terms of total capacity. EPA, again, this is an EPA chart. EPA estimates that even with biogas on every single hog and dairy factory farm that could theoretically install a digester, total capacity is less than 1% of our US natural gas use. Multiple other studies confirm this incredibly small potential, including finding that all of the nation's RNG potential couldn't even power buildings in California alone. It's obvious that the push towards biogas has nothing to do with green energy or getting off of fossil fuels. To dig deeper into why biogas threatens to deepen our climate and factory farm crises, I'm going to hand it off to Rebecca.
Thank you, Tara. Just gonna wait for that slide to pop up. Awesome. Great. Thank you, Tara. That was a great overview. And like Mackenzie said in the beginning, my name is Rebecca Wolf. I'm based in DC. I've been able to work with Food and Water Watch since about 2012. And most recently, over the past couple of years, have been focusing on biogas and factory farm gas across the country. So now that we've talked a little bit about what exactly we're all talking about, we're going to chat more about why it's not all cracked up to be. In short, as Tara covered, we have this huge manure problem from factory farms and the factory farm system, and companies want to get paid for solving that problem. In reality, biogas is really a solution to a problem for them, and that's our movement to ban factory farms and fracking. Biogas and digesters really serve to allow big ag and big oil and gas to continue to both have gas and factory farms and make more money while doing it. So here's what I mean. Next slide, thank you. Whenever we talk to people about factory farm gas or biogas, one of the first questions I often get is, well, what else are we gonna do? And understandably so, we're really tired of a lot of these problems, we're desperate for progress, and it seems like a solution. But I wanted to start with this because this is a frame that these industries really rely on from us. It allows them to cause this big problem with liquid manure and then swoop in and be the hero in their own story. So I want to address the 2 points that they're really relying on here and talk about how this is greenwashing pollution. The first is that all of this factory farm manure and liquid sludge is normal and inevitable. And the second is that this solution being posed by them actually does what they say it's going to do. So first, we have to start with kind of this assumption that having factory farm waste is something that we've always had or always will have. And that's just not true. The big reason that methane emissions from cow manure, or one of the reasons, enteric emissions is a bigger reason, but one of the reasons that we have emissions from cow manure is because factory farms liquefy it and to store it cheaply in lagoons, thereby creating an anaerobic environment for decomposition. On the other hand, pasture-raised animals, their waste actually breaks down aerobically, so with oxygen, and it doesn't emit methane, only a modest amount of CO2. Second, digesters don't actually get rid of factory farm waste or manure. A lot of the way that industry, and I've seen commercials and ads and all sorts of things, talk about this grand new factory farm gas and digesters would really lead you to believe that this technology takes manure and simply magically turns it into energy. That's actually far from the reality of what happens, because at the end of the digestion process, there's a material called digestate, which is the leftover of the manure. And that material has been found to contain higher concentrations of pollutants that are more water soluble, meaning they're more likely to run off into our water system. So essentially what we're doing is concentrating and then exacerbating the pollution problem of factory farms. And this is really alarming, because after they get digestate in the process, often what they'll do is put it on land, which, as we know with the factory farm system, over application on land is a really big problem as well. So when we liquefy and concentrate all of this manure, digesting it doesn't make it go away. It actually generates a new set of pollution problems that still needs to be managed locally, and that's why this is really greenwashing. So as I said, digesters make nutrients more likely to pollute waterways, and this is a picture of algae actually choking a waterway from nutrient contamination. According to our National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, harmful algal blooms can really cause debilitating illness in humans, and although it's rare, it can even cause death. So more on public health. Why is biogas a scam when it comes to our public health? So first, I mentioned before that digesters don't eliminate the waste generated at factory farms. But on top of that, they can still contain, a digested manure can still contain dangerous pathogens. Numerous research studies, including this one here on the slide, point out that digesters simply aren't a reliable tool to eliminate harmful pathogens like the ones that cause zoonotic diseases, as we all have come to know. Digesters don't make the nutrient loads, that's nitrogen and phosphorus. You've probably heard about those big two if you've thought about the factory farm problem. They don't make those nutrient loads in manure evaporate or disappear. Again, they simply extract methane from the manure. And so these nutrients are associated with algal blooms, and we're bringing them to a central location. As for the third, in ammonia, I'm going to get it a little bit deeper in the next slide. So ammonia pollution is this really big piece of the public health and climate change problem that we don't often focus on enough. And I want to get into two studies. The first, a recent study found that deaths caused by agricultural air pollution are greater than those caused by coal power plants. I want to say that one more time because it's huge. Agriculture air pollution causes more deaths than coal power plants. So it's estimated now about 17,900 deaths a year from the entire ag sector, and about 12,700, so about 13,000 specifically from factory farms air pollution. This study also found that that primary source for this ag air pollution is ammonia from livestock operations. So ammonia is a precursor to harmful 2.5 PM air pollution. It's particulate matter, if you've heard that. And without getting too highly technical, that particulate matter air pollution is responsible for respiratory distress and causes worldwide, not just from this industry, but that particulate matter worldwide causes 4.2 million premature deaths globally a year. It's huge. It's a really big problem. And the CDC notes that it's really dangerous because it's the kind of pollution that gets deep in your lungs and can even get deep in your blood. So in another study from 2017, findings concluded that the use of digesters, anaerobic digesters, what we're all talking about today, to generate methane from livestock manure, and specifically in the study dairy, which I know we focus on and talk more about in Oregon, increases ammonia content in waste. And as we just discussed, ammonia is that precursor for that really harmful air pollution that leads to premature deaths. So we know that factory farms cause ammonia pollution, and we know that digesters make it worse. So I'm going to talk a little bit about entrenchment. I work with an organizer in Delaware on our team, actually, who often says, if I were paid to put trash out on the curb every day, I'd make sure I had something to put out on the curb every day. And I think that's a really good example of the perverse incentives at play here. So here are a couple reasons that this is really grabbing hold of the factory farm industry to keep it. First, it's becoming a gold rush. I think Tara talked about this a little bit in the beginning, but there's money to be made here because of some of these incentives. So we're starting to see more and more interest in digesters due to the money that developers can make from incentive programs at the state and federal levels. So for example, I think Tara, you mentioned California gives a lot of money to the CAFO digester projects under the low carbon fuel standard, as well as its cap and trade program. And increasingly, we're seeing different attempts via legislation and funding federal programs to increase incentives for digesters too. A bill actually called the Growing Climate Solutions Act has been tossed around a lot in the last year-ish, and it would serve to put even more money and incentives behind this as well. So the build out of biogas, as I think Tara also mentioned, when we're thinking about entrenchment, would require new pipeline infrastructure to connect digesters with also existing fracked gas pipelines. And this investment in and of itself would entrench factory farms for years to come, as well as gas infrastructure. So for the third, I think, Tara, you also touched on this a tiny bit, but there are a few different studies that have found that this system, mechanisms, inputs, the infrastructure of these models really only work for the largest factory farms. I have a study from Idaho looking at dairies, found that only very large facilities were economically feasible to actually adopt this technology. So Idaho's small sustainable family farmers were left out and also then faced with an even less viable market to compete in. I think what's more is we're seeing these examples of industry of this industry taking hold in the media, in permit applications that really show, as the financial incentives for digesters become available, we're seeing applications for more animals on factory farms as well. And that's another big part of entrenching the factory farm system is we're seeing once digesters go in, looking to get more animals on factory farms as well. So I'm going to skip and go to the next one because I'm rambling on, but I want to talk a little bit about climate change before I pass it to Tara. Back again to talk more Oregon specific. But in thinking about climate change, factory farm gas or biogas, or sometimes what the industry calls as renewable natural gas is certainly not a solution to our worsening climate crisis. For starters, it's building that alliance between big ag and big oil and gas to plainly turn mega dairies into methane refineries. And the fact of the matter is biomethane is indistinguishable from fossil methane and fracked gas. Biogas has about 50 to 70% methane, and we know that methane is a potent greenhouse gas. So they capture methane, but they also distract us from the massive emissions coming from animal digestion itself, or cow burps. I think, Tara, you mentioned a little bit of enteric emissions being a big problem as well. So in terms of climate, we have two things. The cow burps, or the animal digestion, is more than half of dairy's total methane emissions, and that's nowhere in this digester conversation. In fact, as I kind of discussed, digesters are helping factory farms get more animals. So that's more cow burps. And two, the methane captured from anaerobic digesters is only actually created in the first place because of the factory farm manure management practices with liquid waste in anaerobic conditions. So all of that, and then beyond that, using the biogas generated also releases carbon dioxide. So here's the big picture. Digesters cannot provide the climate benefits of more sustainable animal agriculture, such as pasture-based grazing and reducing herd sizes. And proposed biomethane production can only be that really small piece of the overall gas source, with of course, fracked natural gas making up the majority, the bulk. So investing in digester infrastructure only locks in really fossil natural gas as well. And they're really intrinsically linked as the industry intended. So it's big ag trying to capitalize on those bridge fuel lies. So just like we argue that we don't want to be building more gas pipelines and other fossil fuel infrastructure is a waste of resources, that we should be supporting a shift towards renewable energy, we can point to the need for a transition to a more sustainable agriculture system as well, instead of throwing more monies at propping the factory farm system up. Champions of sustainable agriculture also agree with that, Senator Booker, the lead of the Farm System Reform Act, which is a bill we all work on a lot, told Reuters a few weeks ago that money in the Build Back Better Act should be going to family farmers for regenerative practices instead of to digesters, massive digesters. So I'll close my section by leaving you with this before I pass it back to Tara, but we know that dairy factory farms especially release methane. We are coming to know and feel the intensity crisis of climate change. We know the urgency is now. So allowing the oil and gas and the factory farm industry to hand us this scheme and tell us, this is it, there's nothing else we can do about it, so you're gonna have to like it, should be motivation enough. But just like Exxon knew what oil and gas would do to our climate, the factory farm industry has known that factory farms would release climate warming methane. And the only difference with biogas now is they're trying to get paid to do it. So I'll leave you with that, and I'm going to pass it to Tara to talk more about the specifics in Oregon and what we can do about it.
Thanks, Rebecca. So yeah, the urgency is now, and the urgency is also here in Oregon. So I'm going to talk about what's going on and how people can get involved in our fight a little bit. So next slide. So you can see this is a map of dairy capos. Capo is just a technical term for a factory farm. This is a map of dairy capos. And also, if you can see little yellow crosses, that's where there are dairy digesters. And it's hard to count them up, but the good news is that there hasn't been a ton of investment in biogas in Oregon just yet. EPA and the state have databases of digesters that each list only 6 dairy digesters in Oregon. And until recently, most of these have been those farm scale digesters, not the big RNG digesters. A big reason for this is probably that most dairies in Oregon aren't quite big enough to make a digester viable. But for a lot of the reasons Rebecca discussed, we think that's likely to change. All of the incentives at the federal and the state level are lining up for big ag and big oil and gas to partner up in new corporate ventures for huge RNG facilities. In fact, there's a new Shell oil facility that recently started digesting dairy manure and producing that pipeline quality RNG in Junction City, Oregon. So we know that it's coming. These energy ag partnerships and the incentives they're taking advantage of are likely going to make RNG more attractive to existing mega dairies in the state. And as Rebecca said, could spur applications to expand or build new ones. Next slide. So there are a lot of programs that we could talk about in depth. I'm just going to kind of breeze through a couple of them in Oregon that we think are going to incentivize more factory farm biogas. And a lot of these are due to recent legislation and rulemakings at the state agency level. So because of these, Oregon has begun incentivizing RNG in multiple ways. First, there was a 2019 law that required gas utilities to have increasing targets to source a share of their gas from RNG sources. This will ramp up to a target of 30% procurement of RNG out of the total energy mix by 2045. So that's quite a lot of RNG. And Northwest Natural recently took its first step towards meeting this target and claiming reduced greenhouse gas emissions by contracting with an RNG company to buy so-called credits from a Tyson Foods slaughterhouse in Nebraska that has installed a digester. Another program that we're looking at is the state's climate protection plan, which certainly has some good stuff in it, but it's also going to impact gas utilities by actually mandating greenhouse gas reductions, which we're concerned is further going to incentivize schemes like that Tyson deal instead of resulting in real emissions reductions in Oregon. Honestly, I can only imagine some of the corporate partnerships and out-of-state credits that are going to underlie our utility companies' claims of sustainability in coming years, looking at this Tyson example. Another incentive program that I think is increasingly important is the Department of Environmental Quality's Clean Fuel Program. This was just fully implemented in 2016 and it's still ramping up, so it's hard to tell exactly how big a role it's going to play. But the Clean Fuel Program has to do with transportation fuel, and it's modeled after California's Low Carbon Fuel Standard program, which Rebecca mentioned. And the LCFS program in California is a trading program that allows factory farms that are producing so-called RNG to pipe it to California for use as a transportation fuel, and then sell the credits it gets for its supposed emissions reductions which can then be used by California polluters and in the process allow those polluters to keep on polluting and not reduce their own emissions. So I'm going to talk about this program a little bit more later on because it's having even more of an impact in Oregon than Oregon's own clean fuel program so far, because it pays more than Oregon for the same RNG credits from factory farms. And then just one other program I'll touch on because it was a good win for us. Recently with partners, we were able to end a subsidy program actually last legislative session, and that was called the Oregon Bovine Manure Tax Credit. This was a biogas tax credit that was financing a handful of megadairies in the state, and primarily the biggest megadairy in the state. So this was a great step towards exposing biogas as a false solution that isn't deserving of public funding. And it will prevent millions of dollars from flowing to Oregon megadairies. But ultimately, we know that this was a drop in the bucket of federal and state subsidies, incentives, and credit trading systems that we see emerging. Next slide, please. So I mentioned our biggest factory farm, 3 Mile Canyon Farms. And I think it's a good case study because it's really hard to follow all of these programs and follow all of the money and trace, the cause and effect of all of these. But 3 Mile is a good example of how few protections there are against factory farms gaming the system and exploiting public resources that should be spent instead on family farms and truly renewable energy. So 3 Mile obviously has a digester, or it wouldn't be a very good case study. But several years ago, federal stimulus money and a range of state tax credits were required to make 3 Mile's digester financially viable. And actually 3 Mile's general manager at the time was quoted as saying, quote, "We got it to the point with all these different programs to where we could at least break even and service the debt that we took on to build the project. And we felt that opportunity was kind of a one-time opportunity because all these programs came together at once." Then later, when 3 Mile wanted to upgrade to RNG and pipe its gas offsite, it was able to do so with the help of state tax exempt bonds. And now it's selling that gas into California's low carbon fuel standards program. So a ton of different pots of money are making this financially viable. And the sad truth is that this double counting is currently completely legal. And we think it's threatening to make manure more profitable than milk for these operations, while at the same time totally undermining any actual claimed methane emissions reductions and keeping us from reaching our climate goals. So 3 Mile isn't the only factory farm that has exploited the current system, and we have good reason to think the floodgates are opening. Many factory farms have started applying for the California Low Carbon Fuel Standard program because, as I said before, it's very lucrative. The LCFS credits pay more than California's cap and trade program. They pay more than the Oregon Clean Fuel program. And it allows factory farms not to get too technical, but to claim artificially low, what they call carbon intensity for their gas, which results in them getting more credits for their claimed emissions reductions than they should. And as I said, these are worth a lot of money. So as a result of all of these deficiencies in the program, this one California program is actually driving factory farm expansion all over the country. So Food and Water Watch is working on one front right now. I won't go into detail, but we're working with partners to petition the California Air Resources Board to cut factory farm gas out of that program altogether, so that the transportation fuels that are getting credit as being low carbon are truly greener than factory farm gas. But in the short term, we have an opportunity to push back specifically against 3 Mile Canyon's exploitation of the California program. So recently, the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality fined the company that operates 3 Mile's digester nearly $20,000 for repeated violations of its air quality permit. And we looked at these records and found that, in fact, 3 Mile was in violation of its air pollution permit for 5 separate periods of time over the course of multiple years, and was even in violation when it applied to CARB, the California Air Resources Board, to participate in the low carbon fuel standards program. And when it applied for the program, it even had to say, we're going to operate in compliance. And at the time, it was already in violation. So this is significant because California's Air Resources Board has authority to invalidate the low carbon fuel standard credits when a producer isn't in compliance with relevant laws. So yesterday we sent a letter to CARB urging it to do exactly that, to take an enforcement action against 3 Miles Digester, including issuing a significant fine, to invalidate all of 3 Miles credits under the program, and to go even farther and in fact cancel 3 Miles account in the low carbon fuel standards program, so it can no longer profit from this program. And I'm going to turn it over to Mackenzie now to tell you more about how you can support both of these efforts, our petition related to factory farm biogas in the program and our 3 Mile action specifically.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Tara and Rebecca, for diving into that. Before we kind of get into action and next steps, we've got a few questions and answer questions that folks have submitted that I think it would be great to take a moment to chat through. So just a few quick clarifying comments. So CAFO stands for Confined Animal Feeding Operation, essentially means factory farm for those of you who were kind of wondering about that. And 3 Mile Canyon is one of the largest mega dairies in Oregon. It's based in Eastern Oregon. And would love to chat more about all of this. And specifically, you know, Tara, you talked a lot and showed that map of digesters in Oregon, but can you talk about where a lot of those digesters are getting their manure from, kind of where mega dairies are concentrated in Oregon?
Sure. Would it be possible to bring that map back up or not so much?
Let's see. We've got someone on tech back here that will try and work his magic.
I mean, yeah, that's great. Thank you, John.
Thanks, John.
So the one that I mentioned was 3 Mile Canyon, and that's out, as Mackenzie said, in eastern, sort of east central Oregon near Boardman. There's actually also a proposal now for another huge mega dairy right nearby that could potentially want to have a biogas digester as well. And then there are a handful of digesters in the Willamette Valley and also one in the Tillamook area that I believe takes dairy manure from multiple. They're not small, I don't want to call them small dairies, but they're not 3 mile size, you know, tens of thousands of cows, and takes the waste from, I believe, several dairies there. So they're scattered around a little bit. And, you know, like we discussed, it's only the biggest facilities that really could viably install a digester unless they're connected to something more like a regional digester, which is what I believe Shell Oil is operating in Junction City and taking waste from multiple sources as feedstock. So we could see it kind of develop in multiple different ways, depending on which incentives are most powerful and where the infrastructure is easiest to construct, and, you know, what these companies think is best for their bottom line.
That's super helpful. Rebecca, did you want to add anything else to that?
The only thing that, and not to add, but got me thinking that we've talked about this a little bit too, is there are all sorts of kind of different ways that they're trying to do this. So there's regional systems, there's thinking about trucking, there's thinking about pipelines of material going in and material going out. So it's kind of a grab bag of the way that they're trying to hack it, if that helps. You see it differently with different types of animal litter, and all sorts of litter being chicken and manure being hog and cow. But there's kind of lots of different things that you might see. But specifically, of course, in Oregon, lots of the dairy system.
And I think that kind of actually leads us to another question. Someone was wanting a little bit of clarification about no mention of beef manure in a lot of these equations. I know, Rebecca, you just mentioned, but just to put a finer point on that, you know, dairies, and specifically mega dairies in Oregon, are kind of the primary source of massive amounts of manure, which is why we're talking primarily about dairies. But I wondered if y'all could talk a little bit about the beef cattle angle in all this.
I can start. I mean, beef cattle are a big source of pollution in Oregon as well, but a lot of it has to do with the way the waste is managed. And dairy cattle, it's a liquid waste management system, which increases the methane that's actually created. And it also involves big, you know, they call them lagoons or sometimes tanks which store the liquid waste, and those are easier to cap with a lagoon or with a digester, or have the waste flow into a digester. So in terms of just which facilities it's most technologically viable and affordable to convert for digestion, dairies and hog operations are really the two industries where it's most prevalent.
And to give you like the entire flip side of that, there is attempt to do that in the chicken industry. And because that liquid is kind of the feedstock that we're seeing it being tried the best with, they're using all sorts of other, because chicken manure is litter, it's dry, it's got other things in it. They're attempting to kind of combine it with what is called DAF scum, which is the kind of the solids from the slaughter process that is more liquefied. So you're kind of seeing different attempts. You might see other attempts at mixing other sorts of feedstocks as well, but largely the hog and dairy industry.
I'm glad that DAF scum is just as bad as it sounds. When you said that, I audibly gasped, which no one could hear, but I'm glad that, the name fits what it is. So Rebecca, you just mentioned examples of different types of digesters. I wondered if y'all could talk about kind of the landscape of factory farm gas across the country and what we can learn here in Oregon. I know, Tara, you mentioned the California low carbon fuel standard, but if there's other kind of examples of what we could expect in Oregon and why we should be so concerned about this.
I think this is a great place for Iowa if you want to jump in and start, Tara, and then I could talk about some other examples. But
sure. So there are a few states, I think, that have good kind of cautionary tales for what we could expect. In Iowa, we just fought, unfortunately, we were unsuccessful fighting off legislation to allow the biggest hog factories in the state to install anaerobic digesters. And so we expect to see a real influx, unfortunately, of digesters in Iowa. We also know that there are a lot of digesters emerging. Some are farms, individual farm, and some are kind of these so-called community digesters in Northeast Wisconsin, where there are huge manure management and groundwater contamination problems from factory farms. In North Carolina, we've seen Smithfield try to greenwash its hog factories that have been just horrifically impacting environmental justice communities for decades by putting digesters on their existing decades-old huge factory farms. And so we expect to see more of that kind of activity by some of these corporations. And we're also seeing, like we've talked about, a lot of these factory farm companies partnering with energy companies to really double down on fracked gas at the same time as factory farms. So in places where that, I think, is technologically viable and the gas industry sees dollar signs, we're likely to see similar build outs.
I think that was a great overview. The only thing I would add is I've alluded to the example of the chicken industry before on the eastern shore of Maryland, and in Delaware, that's where the chicken industry is highly concentrated. And we've been organizing a campaign to fight the attempts to put digesters in two parts of southern Delaware, and we're opposing the permitting process. There's with any of these, there's kind of the company that submits a permit, and then you figure out if that's the plan as you go along. There's a lot of back and forth as to what the plan of these companies actually is as they evolved. And that's kind of been a big part of that campaign as well. So with our allies, specifically Sussex Health and Environmental Network, we're fighting that industry there. And I'll also add that just in terms of kind of thinking about the landscape, we're seeing some of this at the federal level as well. So I alluded to Build Back Better, but the current language of that legislation has a 30% tax credit for digesters, as well as the two programs that have historically funded some of these projects or attempted to fund some of these projects are REAP and EQIP. And we can send you more information if you're interested about that. I think Christina put the Reuters article that I was referencing, but we're seeing that the Vilsack and Biden administration try to do this as well. So things to look out for.
Great. And I think we have two kind of more technical questions really quick. Someone asked, does the use of digesters to make biogas take other energy inputs to operate? Like what is kind of that footprint, I think is what folks are getting at.
I saw Rebecca nodding her head, so I thought she was going to start this one. But I mean, yes, it is an energy intensive process. And that's why a lot of, facilities that have an on-farm digester, the biogas is used to power the digester and power the farm. And so there's a big cut off the top right there. So I mean, and yes, and these facilities also emit CO2, which is a different question than you're asking, but I think it goes to the overall footprint and efficiency or lack thereof.
Yeah, in the again, the infrastructure looks different for some of these. In the Delaware example, we've got waste being trucked in, and so you can kind of imagine the footprint there. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year is the permit or the idea from the industry, not in the permit technically yet. But that's what we've heard from the industry, and that's obviously very energy intensive. And then along with that, we've got a lot of water considerations with those types of facilities as well. So again, a little bit different than specifically energy, but the footprint being quite large.
That's super helpful. I feel like when I've read information about factory farm biogas from, the industry angle or from kind of the utility angle, there's a lot of talk of like, this is a perfect system. It only decreases emissions without kind of the whole picture. So really helpful to hear from both of you that that's not only not true, but there's also additional emissions to take into consideration with these two. And I think we only have time for one more question. We've got some really, really good ones though in the chat, and we can definitely follow up with folks via email afterwards. But someone was asking for a little bit more clarity about what the Clean Fuels program is. Tara, I don't know if you wanna take that and talk a little bit about Oregon and California, the kind of different examples there.
Sure, yeah. So the Oregon Clean Fuel Program is a program that the Department of Environmental Quality started in 2009, but it wasn't fully implemented until 2016. So it's still kind of getting underway, but it is a transportation fuel program to reduce the carbon intensity of transportation fuels being used in Oregon and help the state overall meet its greenhouse gas goals. So it is also, it's a trading program. So you can sell credits for your reduced carbon emissions from using a lower carbon fuel. And then other, transportation fuel users can buy those credits to supposedly meet emissions goals and say that they have lowered their carbon intensity. And this is a program in Oregon that has been modeled off of the California Low Carbon Fuel Standard program that we talked about, and that 3 Mile Canyon is actually selling into, because the California program is more established and its credits pay more for the same thing. But Oregon really did model almost everything, as far as I'm aware, of its program off of California's, including using the California carbon intensity calculation methods and approval processes for the different, what they call pathways. And I don't really know why they're called that, but they both call them pathways. So aside from the lower credit prices in Oregon, I think as they relate to factory farm gas, the two programs seem very comparable so far.
Great, and I did lie. We got one additional question that is very good that I think kind of caps this off well, but are there any national movements to regulate biogas production? No, if since Tara started, Rebecca, do you want to take this one at first?
National movements, I mean, all of us. I mean, so and maybe Tara, you can maybe add a technical piece to this, but in terms of the national movements, I mean, the work that we're doing, and I think, thinking about some of these technical questions too, the work that we're doing, as I mentioned, ban fracking and ban factory farms is the movement work, because biogas is being posed as a solution to these problems when really they're going like this while they build more factory farms and pipeline infrastructure. So in terms of that, I mean, there's the term factory farm gas came from a bunch of groups that worked together to make sure we were articulating what this actually was, instead of this like fluffy bio sounds good, when in reality it's exactly the same as fracked gas. So to answer your question, yes, it all different pieces, and it kind of is part of the factory farm ban movement and the fracking ban movement.
Tara, did you want to add anything else to that?
I mean, I think that was great. I'll just say, for Food and Water Watch's part, when we talk about kind of regulating the pollution from factory farms, I think we're much more interested in mandating practices that would prevent the methane from being produced in the first place. And that would also kind of shift the landscape towards incentivizing pasture-based family farms and against intensive confinement. That is the root cause of the methane that these digesters claim to be a solution for. So not so much focus on regulating biogas as avoiding the need for digesters in the first place.
And the legislation that we always point to in terms of, if we're talking about Congress, is the Farm System Reform Act that helps transition the food system. And as I kind of alluded to with Cory Booker's statements about how we need to make sure that we're investing in that transition, not throwing more money at these Band-Aids or kind of like fake and false schemes.
I'll also just add to, if we continue to allow factory farms to expand, all of the issues that aren't solely related to climate and waste are still bound to follow. So, pushing out independent family farms, harming the public health of communities with water and air pollution. So I think that also goes hand in hand here as well with, mandating better practices instead of regulating. So. Well, thank you both, Tara and Rebecca. This was great to kind of dive a little bit more into the weeds on biogas. I think we're going to pop up our action steps to end us off. I know we had some additional questions that didn't get answered, so I will be sure to follow up with folks via email on some of those and clarifications that people had. But like Tara mentioned earlier, just yesterday, we sent a petition calling on the California Air Resources Board to invalidate all low carbon fuel standard credits that 3 Mile Canyon Mega Dairy, remember, it's that massive mega dairy, about 70,000 head of cattle in Eastern Oregon, that they received when they were in violation of their air quality permit. And I think Christina is popping a link in the chat for folks to hear more about that. But right now, we really need to help ensure the board hears loud and clear and understands that policies in California are harming communities in Oregon. They have impacts across borders. It doesn't just stay in California. So you can go ahead and click on the link in the chat that I think Christina will pop here shortly to send a message to the Air Resources Board. For far too long, 3 Mile Canyon has polluted our communities. They're the largest mega dairy in Oregon and one of the largest in the country, and have been one of the main sources for ongoing groundwater nitrate contamination in Eastern Oregon, and ammonia pollution in the gorge especially. And, instead of cleaning up their act, they really decided to pursue factory farm gas to help generate even more profit off of their pollution, as both Rebecca and Tara alluded to, really pursuing this false solution of factory farm gas instead of cleaning up their act in the first place. So we do, it's really time for officials to stop rewarding their bad behavior. I hope that everyone can click on that link in the chat to send a message to the Resources Board today. In addition to sending a message to regulators, you can also support this work and this campaign with a monthly donation to Food and Water Watch. A monthly donation really is one of the best ways to support this urgent work over the coming months, and demanding our elected officials guarantee a livable future by stopping mega dairies in Oregon and preventing the build out of factory farm gas across our state. We do a lot of research on this issue, and it also helps make sure that we're kind of on top of the most recent developments when it comes to factory farm gas. So if you can help sustain this work with a monthly donation or increase your current monthly contribution, be on the lookout. I think Christina just posted it for the link in the chat to donate. We truly appreciate your support in helping us fund this fight to win bold and necessary solutions here in Oregon. We're about asking what we need and building the support to get there, and you can be part of helping us do that. And finally, we know that what we really need to ensure Oregon transitions to a clean energy future is to stop pollution at its source, like we've said kind of at the end here, by enacting a moratorium on mega dairies, which is one of the main sources of the raw materials for factory farm gas here in Oregon. So you can join the movement of passionate people helping to do that by attending our January Food and Water team meeting next Thursday at 6 p.m. So in a week, take a week to rest up, do the actions that we put in the chat, maybe read a little bit more, and then come chat with us about elected officials at all levels of government as we head into the 2022 session. And we'll also be talking about priorities for the 2022 Oregon legislative session to build the movement to win a moratorium and to see a just and sustainable food system become a reality in Oregon. So thank you so much again to our fabulous speakers and to everyone who joined us tonight for tuning in. This webinar was recorded, so if you missed the first bit or if you want to go back and listen again to some of the more technical insights that we had, I will be sending this webinar out in the coming days, and you can go back and reference that. And if you have more specific questions, want to figure out how you can get more involved or talk about any of these issues more in depth, I would love to chat with you. There's my contact information. But thank you all so much, and I hope everyone has a lovely night.
Yeah.